When it comes to gaming mice, the last thing that you really consider is the type of switch in there, because pretty much any gaming mouse worth its salt nowadays has a pretty good click with a pretty good feel. However, some of us are a bit extreme and a bit obsessive with some of our things, so today we'll be comparing two of the most common and popular gaming mouse switches on the market, Huano and the ever popular Omron. Now, before I start this video and this little comparison, if you have any questions you want to ask, or if there's anything you want to say, go ahead and put it in the comments, because I reply to every single comment, unless of course you're a bot, then you're ignored. So what are these two companies? I'm sure you've heard of Omron. They've pretty much been the switch manufacturer and switch producer for Razer and Logitech gaming mice since forever. But if you've seen more obscure mice and maybe Zowie mice, Huano switches are what you find there. Both of these are just companies that make switches, but even though the designs are very similar and the feel of both switches are very similar, if you pay attention to both of these types of switches, you would actually notice that there is some sort of difference that you can feel. Mind you, I need to emphasize once again that this difference is not something that would change whether you should buy one mouse or the other, but it's still fun to talk about anyway. Okay, but there is a problem with comparing mouse switches, because you can have two mice with two different switches, but they can feel exactly the same or wildly different, because there are a lot of other factors affecting how a mouse switch sounds, feels and performs. Things like the material of the mouse shell, things like the length of the mouse click, things like the tensioning of the mouse switch, things like that will all affect the differences in a comparison between a Huano and an Omron switch. However, I lucked out because I found this clone of a G102 mouse. This clone of a G102 mouse is pretty much exactly the same when it comes to physical dimensions in terms of switch position, click length, material as the G102. And the only difference between these two mice, apart from the sensor and the scroll wheel, is the fact that the clone uses Huano switches while the Logitech G102 uses Omron switches. And that means I can actually have finally a fair comparison of the two switches now, because now I have two exact bodies physically with two different switches. So here we go. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to the feel of these two mouse switches is really that the Omrons feel crisper and sharper than the Huanos. This is not necessarily a bad thing. The Omrons definitely feel lighter and activate more snappily than the Huanos, but this might be less comfortable and less enjoyable for someone to click on, and this might be purely personal preference as to whether you like it or not. But I like the Omrons more in that they actually feel like they actuate faster, and they feel like they're very snappy and very sharp and precise. The Huanos, on the other hand, feel a lot more stiffer, a bit slower and a bit chunkier. If I were to say the difference between the two, it'd be like actuating a blue mechanical keyboard switch and a brown mechanical keyboard switch. This, however, is not exactly correct, because the difference isn't that big and that sharp, but it's a good analogy for the differences between the feel of the Omron switches and the feel of the Huano switches. Overall though, the Huano still feels pretty quick, still feels pretty snappy to a certain extent, but it does feel a bit spongier and a bit clunkier than the Omron switches. This is not a bad thing. It might be more comfortable for you to use the Huano switch with its slightly more treble and slightly more spongy feel, but for me, I like the Omrons more for its snappy, quick actuation. Now let's talk about the sound difference between the Huano switch and the Omron switch. Interestingly enough, they're both rather similar after they've been worn down a little bit. So if you compare the differences between the left click sounds on both of these mice, you realize that the difference is actually quite little and a bit hard to notice. But if you compare the differences between the sounds of the right clicks on these mice, which are obviously less used and less worn down, the difference is way more obvious and way more apparent than the left clicks. This essentially tells us that the more you use the mouse, the more they're gonna sound the same overall. So if you are really obsessive over the difference in sound and you really like one mouse's sound over the other, don't worry about it in the long run, because in the long run it all kind of evens out. I'm guessing this is due to wear and tears affecting the audio side of things. So for sound, pay attention to the difference between the left clicks and the right clicks, because the right clicks essentially tell you how they sound when they're kind of new, and the left clicks tell you how they sound after a couple of months or couple of years of use. As to my opinion of the sound, honestly I couldn't care less because I always have headphones on, but the huanos definitely sound softer and a bit more muddled in terms of sound. It matches the feel and that's a bit clunkier and lower frequency in terms of sound compared to the omron switches, and the omron switches are sharper sounding, higher pitch, and definitely a bit louder and a bit more jarring. This might not be a problem for you, it really is a subjective thing. So I'm going to play the sound test now and you can determine which one you like more. Just pay attention to the left click differences and the right click differences and remember what I told you. These are the omron switches and these are the huano switches, and we're going to do left click then right click of each, then we're going to compare it one by one. The right click, because it's so used much less than the left click, is going to sound closer to what it sounds like brand new. At least it's what it sounds like from my memory. The right click definitely sounds closer to brand new on both of these mice. But here is a sound comparison, omron and huano. So let's start with the omron. Now the huano. Now one by one. They are mostly equidistant to the mic, and from my ear, this one sounds softer than the omron and a lower pitch. Not just because of the mic's positioning, which might be inconsistent, but not just that, the huanos actually do sound softer, not just because of the mic, because the distance might not be exactly correct. Now let's test out the sound from in front of the mouse to the back of the mouse click, because it sounds different ways depending on where you click it. With the omron. The huano. As you can tell, brand new, the sounds are really different between these two mice. But honestly, as time wears on and you look at the left clicks, they start to sound a bit more similar the more wear in they have had. So that's an interesting observation as well. So let's talk about build quality and reliability differences between these two switches. Honestly, I couldn't tell you anything because I don't have a large enough sample group or use both of these mice enough to tell you which one failed first. And even then, only one in terms of a sample size is not fair at all. But I can tell you that from my experience, both of them have lasted me very, very long and no problem at all. However, from my research, there are some things that I found about these switches that you might want to know when it came to reliability. So if you get a mouse with Japanese-made omron switches, they have a good reliability and a good reputation for lasting for a very, very long time. If you get a huano switch mouse, chances are it usually performs pretty well. So Zowie actually moved to huano switches and their double click issues were all solved and people stopped complaining about double clicks on their mice. However, if you did get a mouse with Chinese-made omron switches, they actually have a pretty bad reputation. This reputation might not hold true today because a lot of these reports were from maybe 2 years ago and stuff like that, so maybe they have changed a little bit, or maybe they're just less widely reported. But Chinese-made omrons do have a reputation of creating double-click issues where if you click once, the mouse double-clicks and stuff like that. And this was a big problem on those old Razer Dev Adders from 2013 and the Razer Dev Adder Chroma, where they use Chinese-made omron switches, and as a result, they often have double-click problems. However, I can't tell you for a certain, because it's not from my own testing and own experience, that Chinese-made omron switches do have double click issues, but I would strongly recommend that if you were to buy a gaming mouse, do research on its reliability from other users, not just the particular switch, but just its overall reliability from other users who have used it in the past. And I would generally recommend you stray away from super brand new mice. If this gaming mouse was all that you can afford, if you could only afford one gaming mouse, get something that's been out for a while, that a lot of people have used for a while, so that you can know whether it will last you for a long time. So if you're working on a tight budget, play it safe and don't just buy the latest mouse that just came out, because you have no idea whether there has some design flaw in there that you cannot afford to replace. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it entertaining, found it enjoyable or educational. This is my comparison of the Huano versus Omron switches. It shouldn't determine whether you should buy one mouse or the other, but it should inform you a little bit as to what each should feel and what to expect depending on the mouse you get, depending on the mouse switch you get. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked it, please subscribe. It really helps me out, and most of you I know aren't subscribed. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.